Welcome back to Heritage and Hope Ministries. I'm your host, Alex Bowen. Today, for the first time, we're joined by Dr. Stephen Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe is a well-known voice in the Christian nationalist movement and author of the 2022 book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. Through his writing and extensive online presence, he argues for what he calls a measured theocratic Caesarism, a model in which the civil government would play an active role in promoting Christianity. You may have seen him in discussions with associates like Douglas Wilson and Joel Webbon. We're also joined by Pastor Jason Viemeister, who you may recognize from our channel through his Reformation Reborn series. Pastor Jason is a pastor, scholar, husband, and father. He has a special interest in church history and the Protestant Reformation and joins us with years of experience in ministry. And then we have my brother, James Bowen, our resident specialist in rare and historic documents that affirm Protestant history, and also Dr. Brian Hustad, a regular contributor to the channel. Welcome, guys. Thank you so much for joining for this interesting conversation. I'll just start us off with a brief word of prayer so that we have the Lord's presence with us here today. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to sit together and reason together. I pray that you would please be present with this conversation and help us to glorify you with our words and actions. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So one of the things that I wanted to kind of first start us off with is, it's my understanding that the Christian nationalist movement is really an answer to some of the godless atheism and secularism that we have seen become rampant in our society. And, we have a lot of things that I think we as Christians, and anybody who calls themselves a Christian, should have a fundamental problem with happening in our society. We have abortion that is rampant, killing of unborn babies. We have gender that has been turned into an alphabet soup. We have marriage that has been perverted. We have drug use in many cities now openly, much more so than previous. I mean, you have people using fentanyl and bent over with the fentanyl bends, you have society has degraded.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess the question that we all have to answer, we all have to be able to answer it as Christians, is what stems the tide of moral pollution and corruption in this world today? We here at this table are Seventh-day Adventists, and Seventh-day Adventists historically have been typically ones that say that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and so we should treat our body in accordance with that. We have a strong emphasis on health principles, on, making sure that we're sober-minded, not consuming alcohol and other illicit substances, and historically wanting to uphold biblical truth. And so, Stephen, you come from a Christian nationalist background, and I'm sure that you would probably agree and resonate with the moral pollution that we have seen, although I don't want to put words in your mouth. How do you see Christian nationalism answering this corruption that we see?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a great question. I could go on and on about that. So I'll try to keep it brief. But I mean, the idea is that Christian nationalism, or just a robust Christian politics, is a way to energize people to get into the political process and advocate for Christian ideas, or simply even just natural truths that have been kind of smothered, and to within the institutions themselves, from the political parties to the bureaucracy to the broader institutions of society, that they would get in those institutions and shape them so that they would, reform the country in a moral and pious direction. So there's a lot I can say on that, but that is kind of the central aim. The central aim is, at least from my perspective, is to provide the philosophy by which other people, I mean, including myself, but other people who are better at the on the ground politics, can then go and achieve things in a concrete way in the world. So it's a broad movement of people doing different things. I'm just one part of it. And I just, again, try to supply the principles and the ends of political action so that people can get involved and have a powerful presence in our institutions.
Now, do you see there's a lot of different voices out there that are part of Christian nationalism at this juncture, and we've actually interviewed on our channel previously Douglas Wilson, Jared Longshore, and Lennox Calafungwa. Those are the three individuals that we've had discussions with, lengthy conversations actually, about morality and society. Do you see a difference between the different flavors, or are there different flavors of Christian nationalism out there? Do you find yourself in complete agreement with Douglas Wilson, Jared Longshore, and the rest, or are there differences and nuances there that can be highlighted?
No, I mean, there are differences between our camp. Like Doug would say that I'm a Thomist, a follower of Thomas Aquinas, which is not very accurate, but I guess it's close enough. It's accurate. It hits the side of the barn, I suppose, the broadside. And there are differences along those lines. I approach things from a philosophical perspective rather than theological or through a biblical argument. So I get criticized a lot for that, but I'm certainly fine with people making that case. But I studied philosophy. That's my method. I approach it that way. So there are methodological differences, and then there are some theological differences. I'm not a post-millennialist. I'm millennial, kind of in the same sort of vein as Calvin and many of the Genevan theologians of the 16th and 17th century. I tend to emphasize more of people and place and heritage, and I come from a more paleoconservative background. The nationalism part can be treated in a way separately or distinct from the Christian part, meaning that I think it's good that you have a people in place that stretches across generations, that's connected to the land itself. So I tend to emphasize those things more than Doug does. I don't think he wholly disagrees with me on that. It's just an emphasis. So there's other things as well. I do think, despite some differences and methodologies and all that, we're generally pushing, moving the ball in the same direction. And so I don't see him as a sort of adversary or opponent. I do see him as a co-belligerent, where oftentimes we are belligerent on smaller issues. And but other than that, I see those guys as moving in the same direction. I just think my kick is sends the ball farther than his. Let me put it that way. I don't know if I'm mixing metaphors. I'm throwing stuff out. I'm still working on the coffee, so yeah.
Dr. Wolfe, thank you so much once again for the opportunity to sit down and discuss. So we've followed some of your work for a number of years now. I would say a lot of it is something that, just from a personal perspective, even though some of the policies you advocate for historically have, caused some considerable distress for people in our background, we bear you no malice or no ill will personally. I guess the question I would have is, in 2023, Jonathan Berry was featured on the American Moments, and I believe actually you were interviewed on the same channel at one point. But he commented that the current time and a half pay on Sunday for Project 2025 was not a panacea.
Do you think this would just result in people getting paid more on Sunday, but it would look all the same?
I think there would be some of that. I don't think this is a panacea.
Mm-hmm.
But the law is a real teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would prompt, as all laws do, meaningful reflection by serious numbers of people about the importance of rest and what rest is for. And separate and apart from its hortatory function, it changes economic incentives.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think you would have a lot of employers who would be shifting work. Now, a lot of employers do a fair amount of this already, because a lot of people naturally disfavor Sabbath work for whatever reason, and often command some kind of premium to work on that.
And in your book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, obviously you have enumerated that you believe in, at least what I'm seeing is that in advancing first table commandments in the Decalogue. What would you view as a panacea or a sufficient law or legislation specifically regarding the fourth commandment?
Well, I know that people, I don't know if you guys, but people in your general camp have talked about this idea of a national Sunday blue law. I've never in my life advocated for a federal law that would mandate a Sunday Sabbath or rest or blue laws. I think those would be unconstitutional because there's no power given to the federal government to make that sort of thing in the Constitution, in the articles. And apart from the First Amendment issues, if there are any, so I'm against that. Also, I just don't think it's enforceable because the federal government, unless they have an agreement with the state, has to enforce their own laws. So I think it's kind of a preposterous idea. I've never heard of it until someone accused me of believing it, actually, nor have I denied it because I thought no one would think that would be plausible. But when you think about the local levels, the state and local levels, it would have to depend upon the composition and characteristics of those people. I think if you have a largely Protestant county or a largely Protestant state, then you can have laws that shut down ordinary commerce on Sundays. And the intent there would simply be to create conditions that would encourage worship. So it wouldn't be compelled worship. It wouldn't be compelling people to have faith. It would simply create outward conditions such that people can put away ordinary earthly concerns so that they can focus on the purpose of that day, or at least the purpose of that worship, which would be more heavenward. So in other words, it just conduces to healthy worship without forcing.
In an interview that we observed with Douglas Wilson, one of the remarks that he made is that he does foresee in the future a national honoring of the Lord's Day.
I do believe that the Sabbath is going to be part of a reformation of our morals. I don't believe the fourth commandment has been retired in any way. So if there is a national reformation and revival, I believe that that will result in a national honoring of the Lord's Day. I do believe that that's going to happen. This is the extent of the persecution that I'd be willing to deploy against a Seventh-day Adventist. He would not be able to go into a shop and buy a shovel. That's the extent of the
Right.
That would be
Well,
the
it's funny.
extent of the persecution.
And so certainly in Project 2025, there was a call for a federal amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act. So at least on some sense, there are some voices out there that are calling for a federal legislation in that regard. Would that be something that you would support as a means of advancing what you see as Christian principles in our nation? Would you support legislating on a federal level?
No. I again, like I said before, I mean, you meant like the Fair Labor Act. I'm not familiar with what you're talking about, but or what that legislation would entail. But in terms of shutting down ordinary commerce on a Sunday, that would not be within the powers of the federal government, nor would it be feasible to enforce. Again, unless again there is an agreement with the states to do it. But if the states already agree to do it, why don't the states just have their own law? I would prefer all these things to be at the state or county level, where they are better, where they're actually enforceable, and also they're tailored properly to the characteristics of the people themselves. And I mean, again, this was part of the wisdom of the First Amendment, which was not to separate God from civil government, nor was it to separate church entirely from state at the state level. It was just meant to constrain Congress, because that's the first word of the First Amendment. So I think it's best to keep these sorts of things at the local level, and for several reasons.
So your issue isn't with the structure and enforcement of something like that. It would just be that your issue would be if it was done at a federal level.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to do it at the federal level.
Right.
I guess the reason why we ask that is because, Project 2025, the section written by Jonathan Berry specifically says that they want to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to pay people time and a half for time worked on Sundays. And they say it would default to Sundays, but then they also have an exemption clause in there for other faiths, basically other faith traditions. And then you also had the Heritage Foundation more recently than Project 2025, because Project 2025 is kind of a little bit old news at this point. I mean, Donald Trump is in place at this point, and there was a lot of discussion about Project 2025 before before he was elected. But now in 2026, you've had the Heritage Foundation come out with Saving America by Saving the Family, a foundation for the next 250 years. Now, obviously, this coming summer is going to be this country's 250th birthday from 1776. And so, there's a lot of celebrations that are taking place in Washington, D.C. They're going to have the National Day of it's the National Day of Prayer, I believe, or something on May 17. And then they're also having a big celebration on July 4. And basically, there's all kinds of events going on in D.C. that whole time. So when the Heritage Foundation writes this article about a foundation for the next 250 years, they're kind of saying, okay, how far have we come as a nation? Quite far. We're now the most powerful, nation on earth. What's going to happen in the next 250 years? And one of the things that they call for quite explicitly is a universal day of rest. And they say that state laws, once the blue laws have been repealed and basically gotten rid of, they're very difficult to reinstate. And so they say a universal day of rest essentially makes that easier and makes it so that it's no longer, repealed. Because what if you had a liberal state that is more atheistic? I think of some of the states like California or something like that. You're never going to get them to institute a blue law. At least I don't see it happening very easily for California. Now, maybe you could do it on a county level, like you're saying, Stephen, but you're probably not going to get them to do it on a state level. And so if that's the case, well, then a universal day of rest, according to the Heritage Foundation, would basically solve that problem. But that's interesting. I did not realize that you were against a federal day of rest. That's interesting.
So I guess the question I would have is, if we keep this, if the policies are advocated for at the state level, I guess the question I would have is, historically, how far should a penalty go to enforce such? I mean, certainly they've been advocated for at the state level previously. We have here the Chattanooga Sunday Times, where our people were arrested and put in chain gangs and had all kinds of persecution back in the late 19th century. And these were laws at the state level. Would that be something that you would, what kind of penalties would you support at the state level for those who don't agree with the Sunday legislation and who work on a Sunday?
I don't want to punt on the question, but I will say that it is a matter of policy. So it's not going to be a universal set of punishments. I don't know about the whole chain gang thing. It would seem to me that like nowadays it would be easier to do some sort of monetary consequence or financial consequence to ensure that at least people's businesses are closed to the public. In terms of the actual active work itself, I think people they're not compelled to attend church, but if they actively work on their own private property or even in their store itself, the law, to my mind, would be to just deny public access. So that would deny people a source of revenue for that day, obviously, because they can't sell their stuff. Unless I suppose people would drive onto private property and pick it up or whatever's enforceable. But I don't know the exact what would be the exact punishment for it. But it would have to be enforced. So if there is a law, there'd have to be some sort of sanction involved with the behavior. One of the questions, so I don't know the history of what you're referring to, that Seventh-day Adventists were put in jail or, chain gangs or whatever. A lot of times if you read the actual penalties for crimes, the most severe side of it is either never or rarely actually brought upon anyone. But if there are historical instances of the chain gang, I just don't know. But again, I think that there are ways to tailor this so that it meets the end. The end of it would be maintaining a day of people focused not on earthly things, but higher things. It'd be a day where someone who is not inclined to go to church would be reminded to attend church because they can't go out and do ordinary commerce, and that would encourage worship. So in some ways, I think you guys, even though you would disagree with the day, at the very least, I think you guys could recognize that that sort of condition would be conducive to that end of worship, right? Because you guys, I'm assuming you guys are, you would affirm that worship on Sunday is valid, even if it has an illicit quality to it, right? There's an unlawful quality to it because it ought to be on Saturday. But if I attend church on Sunday, it's still valid in the sense that God is still worshiped by my church. I mean, I make that assumption. So even though you guys would disagree with, again, the law on that day, you still, I think, can recognize that that law on that day could conduce to people worshiping God. I mean, would you guys agree with that?
No, actually, we would not agree with that. We would also reject the law if it were to be on Saturday. So we reject the law on the basis that it is coercive entirely.
I could agree, Stephen, with what you're saying in the broadest sense that you can worship God on any day of the week. God can be worshiped on any day of the week. However, there's only one day that is laid out in the Ten Commandments where we are to rest. And so there's also a commandment there to work on the other 6 days. So the issue is historically how this went down, which we have an article here, or basically a collage of different newspapers. So we went back and searched in the 1880s, and we found these articles, and there's actually pictures of Adventists that were in chain gangs at rock quarries breaking rocks because they worked on Sunday. There was a story of a man who was digging a well on his own property, and the newspaper article says neither by sight nor sound was he disturbing his neighbors, and yet they arrested him and threw him into jail for it. And so this isn't just like one, isolated instance. You have St. Louis, the Knoxville Sentinel, you have the Bradford County Telegraph. You have stories, and this wasn't just one or two stories. There was actually multiple arrests across the United States for this. And there was even accounts of young children being arrested for breaking Sunday blue laws on a state level. And so they were persecuted for this. Now, the issue is then, well, in 1888, you also had the Blair Sunday Rest Bill, which was proposed by Senator Henry Blair out of, I think it was New Hampshire. Yeah. And that was to be done on a national level. And obviously it did not pass. But there's actually a book right here that we have, the Sentinel, from the Sentinel Library, the National Sunday Law, and it actually gives the arguments in Washington, D.C. before the Senate discussing the notion of a federal day of rest, which I understand that you have said you're not a proponent of that. But basically just kind of goes back and forth, and that it's actually a fascinating read to go through. But if the commandment says to work 6 days, and I am prevented from working on that day, is it not impeding my free right to commerce, or not just commerce, but work? Like, let's say I own a shop, like a bakery shop, and I'm forced to close on Sunday, and I'm going to church on Saturday Sabbath, then is it not impeding my free right to work as specified in the commandment? Do you get what I'm saying?
Does it impede your work, your ability to work on a Sunday? I mean, at the very least, the way I would advocate for these laws, it would impede your ability to sell your wares on a Sunday, but that wouldn't preclude you from actually working itself. I don't see, I don't see any necessity in, because again, the end of it is making conditions conducive to people worshiping. And if the majority of the people of that jurisdiction are going to be, more, I guess you say, traditional Protestants on when you worship, then that law would still encourage those people to attend church, even if someone is in his shop, but the door is required to be locked and not publicly accessible. So I think you could still work. At least that's my position. there might be others out there who want a blue law that would be more restrictive, even for someone digging a well on his property. I'm not one of those people, because the way I see, again, legislation is what's the end in mind. You tailor the means to the end. And I think what I've presented so far is actually a sufficient means to that end. You guys wouldn't like it, of course, because then you don't have the revenue on Sundays. But I do think just even in general, it's within the government's right to have certain laws concerning commerce on certain times and days in order to limit it for if they have a compelling state interest. And I think encouraging piety is a compelling state interest. So yeah, I mean, does that alleviate some? Like, I'm not trying to like make my position lighter so you guys would be happy. It's just like genuinely my position, you know?
What you've highlighted is, I think
Yeah.
that based off of what you've said, it seems like you have a genuine concern that we have a country that returns to God, that has a genuine revival. At least I think that is the pathos and ethos of what you're trying to convey. And so in that, I can agree with you that I would love to see our country turn back to God, and I want to stem the tide of moral corruption. I think the rub that we're going to have is that the way we do that, if we force other people to close down their shops, even if you forced them to go to church, which I understand you're not advocating for, but even if you forced them to go to church, it's hypocrisy, right? Because it's not genuine religion at that point. And so can you legislate revival, essentially? I don't think you can. I think that's the Holy Spirit's job. And so, I don't, Pastor Jason, you haven't said much so far. What are your thoughts on how do we stem this tide of moral corruption?
So first, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on to discuss with us, Dr. Wolfe. I think that a lot of what you're sharing is just so very beautiful. I love how in your book you opened with the French Revolution, something that people don't often talk about. And you brought out how, that's kind of the secular tide that kind of came from there. Mm-hmm. And it's quite a contrast with the American story. And you brought that out later in your book, how you talked about how the idea of religious freedom as it exists in this country originally came from religious ideas and from Protestants. And that's exactly right on. It was a religious idea. I think one of the things that becomes difficult with even the question you asked us, and I want to keep going actually and affirming you because there's so much to affirm. I love this nation, this American people. My mother used to always tell me, you're as American as apple pie, because one of my ancestors actually came on the Mayflower. And there's a lot to love about this people, and we want to see this nation flourish in all that God intended it to be. And I do think over the course of its history, we have seen God use this nation and work through the people of this nation to bring a great amount of good. And that word good is really important to you. I've really valued the way you've used that word good to say that Christian nationalism is kind of about seeking both earthly good and heavenly good. And that might be part of where I feel like we have a little bit of a tension in the earthly good and the heavenly good. I know you've also mentioned in a podcast I listened to you speak about how sometimes you don't have to have the majority to win out your conversation. It can be the minority. And in the story of American government and the founding of this nation, it does seem that it was a minority of dissenting Protestants. Maybe take Roger Williams, for example, and his idea of two tables of the Decalogue, that the first 4 commandments have to do with worship to God, and the last 6 have to do with worship, or rather relations between fellow men, and that the government has a responsibility to seek the common good in the first or in the last 6 commandments on the second table, but that government can't compel the conscience and really has no business in legislating man's duty to God. And this was, from their view, dissenting Protestants, an outflow of the basic Protestant impulse, which is that the individual, guided by their conscience under the authority of Scripture alone, kind of has to kind of make decisions, and that's a duty that the state needs to respect. And so kind of that distinction, I guess all that is leading up to say, you know, when you ask us, well, wouldn't you be okay if we just, wouldn't you see a common good in restricting this commerce so that people can then worship God on Sunday? Part of the tension in that question for us is that kind of stemming from that dissenting Protestant view of two tables of the Decalogue, it just seems like, how would you, I guess my question for you would be, how would you evaluate that dissenting Protestant tradition of keeping the government legislating only in the second table of the Decalogue? How did you see that playing out in American history, and what's the validity of it in this conversation for today?
Yeah, well, there's a lot I could say about that. You mentioned my favorite nut, which is Roger Williams. I'm not a fan, let me put it that way. Yeah, I think the dissenters, to put it broadly, I think the dissenters, they swung all the way to one side of saying that the state has no invested interest in piety. And that was plausible when we were in a majority Protestant society or majority Christian society in which every neighbor was a Christian of some sort, whether it was genuine or nominal. And that makes a lot of sense. And I can see how someone in the 18th and 19th centuries would say something to the effect of, hey, why can't we just keep the state out of religion? We seem to be doing just fine. I think that perspective, though, in the last 50 years, but especially in the last 20 years, has come under strain. And that's not only because people have kind of left the Christian religion, but I think there's probably more nominal people than we recognize. But now we have a lot of immigration that is even non-Christian itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so that very principle itself has now come under strain. So now in a beautiful rural North Carolina landscape, there is a Hindu temple going up with a statue to a monkey warrior god.
Right.
Now, I know you guys would find that horrible and you hate to look at that from the highway amidst the pines and all that. And you guys, I'm sure, would say, well, maybe immigration is the problem, that's true. None of that would happen if we didn't have immigration from non-Christian countries. But still, if you listen to the rhetoric around that, it's made it so that is possible. And there's other things I can say about that as well. So I think it's come under strain. And again, I think the dissenters were taking advantage of the fact that they already lived in a Christian culture. They cannot conceive of the American people just as a body of human people agreeing to people of foreign religion coming over who would do something like that.
I want to quibble just a little bit with your depiction of dissenting Protestants as basically saying that, the government shouldn't care about man's duty to religious worship, because actually they did care. And it was precisely because they did care that they felt it was necessary to protect the individual in exercising that conscience from government coercion.
Yeah.
And there's a great book. I don't know if you're familiar with Robert Wilkins' book, Liberty and the Things of God, but he basically depicts all the way back to how, Tertullian and Lactantius, even in the early church, would have viewed kind of the primacy of freedom of conscience as something that needs to be protected from the state. And when I hear, like in your book, you bring up the title of the Christian Prince, which to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it conveys for me immediately back to kind of like just after the Reformation settlement and the Treaty of Augsburg, with like each prince, whatever he believes his whole kind of group or his subjects also need to believe. And it was a way that was intended to protect social cohesion, which I think is another big kind of emphasis of yours. But it ended up resulting in a lot of dissenters getting slaughtered or having no place to go. And also, it ended up resulting in the opposite of social cohesion when you look at the 30 Years' War and how it led to basically every prince fighting for his own view. I don't know. Any responses to that? just overall?
Yeah, I think here you have to distinguish prudent or principle and prudence. I mean, I get into the Christian Prince thing, what I mean by that in a second, but when you distinguish principle and prudence, so I think in principle you can have an established church and suppress false religion. You can throw heretics in jail, but that would be a matter of principle. So that means that it's a permissible power, or you could say it's a moral species of a genus of promoting religion. It's lawful, but that doesn't mean it's always prudent and appropriate or meets the end in mind. So, I think that when we consider the American context, I think even going back to Puritan New England, we can recognize that there was a development regarding prudential application of the principle. So if you take like the principle as promoting true religion, that can look like Calvin's Geneva, or it can even look like 19th century America, which is radically different in institutional ways. The difference, obviously, institutional differences, but in the 19th century, there is high religious liberty, but that's largely because we're already a religious country, and it actually kind of worked. Like Americans had high religiosity in the 19th century without an established church, and of course there were Sabbath laws and blasphemy laws and all that, but the culture itself held it together. But in that sense, the nation as such was promoting true religion. But I think that nowadays we have a different environment, and that principle then has to be applied in a different way. So I'm not in principle I'm not against disestablishing a church. I'm not against removing some of these laws that restricted certain dissenting groups and that now allows them to be free and do what they want. But when you're in different conditions, that means you'd have to apply the principle in a different way. And I think in our conditions now, at the very least, it means that we should have a national interest in restricting pagan false worship, non-Christian worship. And we should have an interest in restricting immigration from countries of that sort. And even like Latin American countries where they have very, very nominal Roman Catholicism, I think all that is also a threat to our national interest. So that's how I would approach that issue. So whenever we talk about promoting true religion, people jump back into like Geneva, or they jump back in like the Baptists being whipped in like, New Haven or Boston. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I would prefer to go back to a sort of like 19th century arrangement where there is pretty extensive religious liberty, but there's also a national self-consciousness of we are a Christian people, and that plays itself out in national life, and then applies it given the context. But anyway, that it's a matter of policy. So again, principled, permissible, prudence. I hope that explains things a little bit better. Doesn't give you a concrete policy choice, but that's my specialty, is avoiding concrete.
In chapter 9 of your work, one of the things that you said was you spoke about Calvin, and mentioning Geneva, and of course that tradition, distinguishing 3 grades of error, and specifically that some grades of error require capital punishment. And one of the things that you commented on was Francisco Suarez, of course, coming again. We might speak as well here of the Thomistic tradition of heretics ultimately being able to receive capital punishment. We have a book here. This is actually we imported from Italy, and this details some of the persecution that the Albigenses or Waldenses experienced in the valleys of Piedmont. This book, I think, is from 1650s, around there. But I guess the question I have is in speaking about returning to this 19th century ideal, certainly in your book, there were principles that appealed back to much older, and even in early American history, within certain colonies, the third penalty for like a blue law violation was the death penalty. And what I see here is that you stated that perhaps a Christian people may consider some heretics harmless, and they might conclude that suppressing heresy is, in at least some cases, more harmful than the heresy itself. The crucial point here is that civil action against heretics is justified in principle. And obviously you emphasized discernment, care, gentleness, and prudence, and different degrees of heresy. But for those who persist, those who steadfastly say, you know, we will not bend on this principle, would you ultimately, I mean, at least from what I'm reading in the book here, and maybe I'm reading you wrong, but would you ultimately support these principles that Calvin, as you say, Calvin mentioned, and Francisco Suarez and Thomistic, that for that heretic who persists against all admonition, ultimately the death penalty for that individual as a threat to society?
I think that given the context of the society and the characteristics, and given the nature of the heresy, if the heresy is the sort of heresy that would require, that actually would in some ways overthrow the state and causes such disturbance that it becomes a threat to the very society itself, I think it could lead to that. I think it's morally permissible. But again, it goes back to what I said earlier. You have to consider what is the end of what you're seeking, and is that the appropriate means to that end? I mean, you just take like early New England, like in Boston, they would have the Quakers would show up, and the Quakers were nuts. Like, but nowadays we think of Quakers as just like the nice liberal lady with short hair and, you know, screams on the side of the road about something like, you know, no kings or whatever. But back then they were just as nuts, but in different ways. And so they would show up to Boston and they would cause disturbances. They'd show up in the middle of church services and start screaming and cursing at ministers. They'd wear bags and blackface. They were bizarre people. And they were banished like 5 or 6 times out of Boston and said, look, you cannot be here, go somewhere else. But they'd always deliberately come back. So they'd deliberately go to disturb. And increasingly, Boston increased the punishments of them because they didn't get the hint that they were not welcomed at that place, and eventually led to the execution of 2 people. But even back then, that execution was very, very controversial, even in England. I mean, you have people writing, their friends in England writing to the New England ministers saying, you know, you shouldn't have done this. And there's historical dynamics at play there with the English Civil War and all that. But still, it's like, I'm just saying that a lot of times in these situations, you have this sort of fledgling community. It's a community that's built around a confession. You have people with religious fervor who don't get the hint that they shouldn't be there, and they're persistent in returning. In the end, if you think of a society in the wilderness in New England or wherever it is, eventually something's got to break and the end has to be achieved. And so, but I think in modern society, again, I just don't think that executing heretics is going to be a very effective means to the end. And so, but anyway, I mean, what you quoted from the book, so you have to understand with that book, just to like clarify, the book is mainly about political philosophy or political theology in the abstract, not necessarily applied to America itself. I don't mention the United States very much at all until the last chapter, and then in the epilogue a little bit. And so you have to take the principles and consider what's permissible and then apply it prudentially in a political mindset of means to ends. And so that would, I think, clear up a lot of these, a lot of the confusions around my work, which because people want to thinking they're not separating like the abstract and the concrete application of it.
I can appreciate that, and it would be important to make that distinction. And I appreciate your emphasis on like you have to understand the times and the experience and adjust. What would you say to someone who says, but looking over history, whether it's Michael Servetus being killed by Calvin or whether it's all the Baptists who, I mean, you mentioned like, well, what if their ideas, religious ideas, are threatening the very fabric of society? But that was exactly how Anabaptists were perceived for centuries.
Well, what about John 11:50? Nor considered it expedient for us that one man should die for the people and that the whole nation should not perish. So basically, there's a notion even in Scripture where you have, you know, better that one man die than like all of society be thrown into chaos. And that was the very justification for crucifying our Lord and Savior.
Yeah, and that was unjust. So, you know, obviously to kill an innocent man. But I'm saying if they're violating a just law and they're persistent in violating a just law, then they deserve the punishment. I mean, we do this sort of thing all the time. Like you say, like
Who decides what a
like
just law
like
is?
violating the
Yeah.
like violating the public peace, right? So I used to live in Baton Rouge, and there was someone down the road from me who would have parties at his house until 1 a.m. every month. And I would every month call the cops because I'm trying to get to sleep. I don't sleep well and I need some sleep. And he's not on my property, he's on his own property. He's not physically assaulting me, but he's disturbing the peace. And so I call the cops, and I don't think he ever got fined, but he's still, I'm applying the force of government to that for means of civil peace. And so we have laws like that all the time that would consider, what's the best for society, broadly speaking, and we apply those. Yeah, and I think the same would be true with religion. Is that it's a like true piety is good for a virtuous citizenry. That is, if the government wants a peaceful society of virtuous citizens, then one way to achieve that virtue is to promote true piety. If it's false piety, and we know from history that even the best of the pagans went wrong often because they had false piety. Like, they can recognize all sorts of virtues, but it's when they begin considering the gods that they then become inflamed with certain lusts that end up actually being poor and or bad for the society. So
one of the things that I'd watched is Joel Webbon, which I know you've had discussions with Joel Webbon before, and you may have some differences in opinion ultimately with Joel Webbon. I don't know. Maybe you could speak to that. But Joel Webbon had talked about capital punishment, and he had said that basically the maximum penalty a lot of times is not applied in law. So, but you may have it there, but you don't necessarily apply it. But nevertheless, it still can be considered.
I would look at all these specific moral laws in the Old Testament, and some of them being civic laws, civil codes. And I would say that the ones that specify the death penalty, that according to the Noahic covenant in Genesis chapter 9, there's actually only one crime, not only a sin, but it's also a crime, that merits or mandates even capital punishment, and that is the taking of someone's life. In the case of adultery or the case of breaking blue laws, which we had on the books here in America for quite a long time, Sabbath laws or blasphemy laws or these kinds of things, wherever the death penalty is mentioned, I would see that as that would be a maximum penalty. So in the state of Texas, you see signs, don't mess with Texas, littering, $2,000 fine or 5 years in jail. And I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone who's doing hard time in prison right now. It's like, man, I've been here 3.5 years, 18 more months to go. I threw a Coke bottle out the window. And so what I would say is for repeat incessant offenders, homosexuality, for instance, not police going into private homes, but if someone is trying to indoctrinate children, they're writing paraphernalia, they're leading parades that are grotesque, egregious, where people are nude. They've done it again and again and again and again. They've received certain fines, certain penalties. They've been told to cease and desist. It's been years. They continue. Then yes, it could raise all the way up as a maximum penalty to that point. So that's how I look at the Old Testament. I know you would disagree, but just to answer the question.
So for the same would be for blasphemy and adultery, for example. Repeat offenders could theoretically face the death penalty.
Theoretically, a repeat offender could.
So he's kind of saying that, at least in a veiled sense, let's say you had somebody who maybe they're not pro-LGBTQ, but they're very much against blue laws, and blue laws get passed, and they're out there marching and saying this is wrong, this is against the Bible, this is we don't believe this, and they're basically making a nuisance for themselves. You can apply the same concept that eventually they would reach a point where they're being obnoxious enough that capital punishment is warranted, and that is the maximum of the penalty. Now, bearing all that in mind, and just as an aside, just as a quick question, do you and perhaps this is stating the obvious, but you do believe that we should legislate all 10 of the 10 commandments? Is that right?
Well, it depends. Well, no, not necessarily. well, yeah, let me. Yeah, I think that as a general principle, I mean, just getting to the first table, I think elements of the first table can be legislated.
Okay, you
Like the
mentioned
first,
like a Hindu temple, for example, like with
yeah.
idolatry,
So
right?
a Hindu temple would be a violation of the first and second, and I guess perhaps the third. I didn't think about that, but it'd be a violation of the first and the second table. So I mean, first table would be something obviously condemns polytheism, it condemns atheism,
Right.
and so I think it could be, it's morally permissible to have some kind of legislation against public atheism and idolatry, or I should say against polytheism. That would be, but it would be the public expression of it. So like someone can be an atheist in heart, but they're if it's legislated against, then they don't express it outwardly.
So like having a
that's kind of
temple, like
the effect of it.
like a Hindu temple, for example, would not be permissible because you have idols on the outside of it that everybody can see that they're
Right.
Okay. So
Yeah,
so
because architecture is a public feature generally, and it belongs to the public, and the architecture of the public ought to be conducive to the good of the community. So that's definitely not everything goes in the public when it comes to architecture. That should be regulated.
right.
So yes. That's your
Now
question.
the I guess the big rub then is if we're going to legislate this, well, then whose interpretation? You know, I have a Convert's Catechism of Catholic Doctrine here that was printed in 1957. And if you go through here, it has the Ten Commandments spelled out specifically in this catechism, actually. And it talks through, you know, what are the Ten Commandments, essentially. And one of the things that I think is interesting is it essentially just completely cuts out the second commandment. So it says the Ten Commandments are, number 1, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me. I think we would all agree with that. Number 2, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Number 3, remember thou keep holy the Sabbath day. And so they completely, and you know, I have it right here, they completely chop out wholesale the second commandment, and then they take the 10th commandment and they split it into 2, and they say number 9 is don't covet your neighbor's wife, and number 10 is don't covet your neighbor's goods. So, and I think we all know that if you go to a Roman Catholic church, you're going to see idolatry. At least as a Protestant, I would call it idolatry. You have Mary, where they say it's just, you know, we're just what phrase do they use, James? Adoring or venerating. They're just venerating.
Yeah,
But you know, they have certain saints over there in Rome that they've kissed the foot off so many times. They've literally had millions of people come by and kiss the foot to the degree where they literally have to replace the foot because there's so many people kissing it. And you have you know, literally lighting candles before Mary. And so you have idolatry rampant. What do you do with that? If your goal is to legislate morality and you have to legislate the first 4 commandments, how do you get around the fact that you have 1 billion Catholics around the world that are breaking the second commandment and wholesale chop it out of the catechism that they claim to believe?
Yeah, they like to combine the first and second so they can get away with the sort of things you're talking about. But yeah, so within our traditions, the first and second, of course, are distinct. We distinguish those. But I mean, enforcing the first does not mean that you have to enforce the entirety of the second. So I'm Presbyterian, and if I were to enforce the entirety of the second commandment, it would mean everyone's forced into be essentially Presbyterians. And so I don't think we should. Again, it's a matter of judgment, prudence, and means to end. And so I would say that unless it's like a sort of non-Christian idolatry, which ends up already being captured in the first commandment, I would just apply just the first commandment. And probably the second command would be applied just kind of sort of accidentally. So I think it's more of, you know, atheism, polytheism, And then I think also, I mean, the third commandment, like the sort of dishonorings of Christ, you see some of the artwork we've seen over the last 30 years. That stuff, I think, should be, I say legislated. If I could say one more thing on that, I would actually prefer that instead of, I mean, the ideal situation is that society itself sees itself as Christian enough to look upon these things, atheism, politics, as disgusting, as something they are repelled, and that socially they feel a sort of they're repelled from it. So think of like, and we do this all the time. Like racism itself is not against the law. Like you can publicly be racist all you want, and you can say whatever you want. You're not going to be dragged before the law for saying racist things. But if you do say racist things, then in the end, you're going to be significantly, there are social costs with it. And so people who might have racist thoughts withhold saying those things for that reason. I think that if we have a society that is fervently Christian, then all could actually don't need to be legislated, that society itself can regulate it. So that would be the ideal state, but I'm not against in principle any kind of legislation. I hope I wasn't breaking up there. I apologize again.
Oh,
I hope
it
you
broke
heard
up
all
a little, but I think
that.
I think we got most of what you were saying there.
Okay, you caught it. You caught it. You know, I live in the country and I don't know what to do. I've tried. I pay enough money, I think, to get decent internet, but I just can't do it.
Starlink.
Starlink, yeah.
No, I have too many trees. There's trees everywhere, and I don't have a direct line of sight with sufficient sky span. So anyway,
I
no one
think
cares about that. Continue.
I think my big issue is not with obviously the law itself. I would affirm the law. It's with setting certain systems in place in society that would compel people into a form of worship. When I read about Jesus in the Bible, in Revelation, it talks about he stands at the door and knocks. I don't think that we can, and I'll just speak from, my own personal experience. The more you try to compel or push me into something, my innate nature is to push back against it.
Human nature is rebellious.
Human nature is rebellious. But that being said, if you try to push people into a form of worship, you're going to have that natural push, at least by some people, to push back against that. And like I said, I don't think you can compel heart change. I think that's not our job. I think that's the job of the Holy Spirit, as kind of has been mentioned here previously in our discussion. But I think that's kind of my biggest issue when I look at it, is not so much the law itself, because like I said, I would affirm God's law. It's the system that is put in place, because ultimately you have to decide, to Alex's point earlier on John 11:50, and it says, "Nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not." That kind of thought process led to the death of Jesus, which of course you said was an unjust punishment or unjust killing. But I would like to point out that was the civil and religious authority at that time that made that decision, and in their mind it was just. And so when you talk about putting a system in place to compel people to worship, and then, you have a kind of a series of punishments that would take place that would kind of scale and escalate, if you had continued breaking of that. Do you see and again, we talked about, I understand that you would be against federal legislation, but would be for local legislation. Do you see, in your mind, would you be for, let's just say, a state or county legislation for blue laws, for example? And in that county, for example, you had a mix of Protestants, Catholics, different faiths. Maybe the majority were Sunday keepers, and you had a minority that were Sabbath keepers. And if you had, you started that system in place, and the Sabbath keepers, were preaching against Sunday legislation. Maybe they were going into the streets, and they were going and talking to the people and preaching from what their view is their sincerely held belief against worship on Sunday and for the biblical Sabbath. Do you see that there's ever a time where that could escalate to that point where you did actually have those people with potentially facing capital punishment? And if so, is there a biblical precedent for that?
I don't think for simply saying that anyone should receive capital punishment. I mean, you're talking at a level of abstraction that my philosophical brain, I have to get concrete. Like if we're in the American context, we're not. If someone is lawfully demonstrating per the First Amendment, freedom of speech, then they should not be. Then their speech should not be punished. I mean, if they truly are disturbing the civil peace by an unlawful protest, because it has to be under law, that would not be so much for the speech, it would be more for the fact that they're violating the law. But really what you'd all be doing is you'd just be doing what Americans do in politics, which is you demonstrate and you state your argument, and then I get the opportunity to state mine, and if you guys win out, then you would win. I think that actually, as I said earlier, I think you guys yourselves, even though you disagree with a component of Sunday Blue laws, I think you guys should support it because it actually would make a better society. It would contribute, it would promote piety, and you would live in that society, a society of a more pious and then therefore virtuous citizenry. So even you have an interest, even though you don't like one part of it. The end of it is something you should enjoy, whereas the means you might not. So.
I guess the picture that we're concerned about is fundamentally what we believe is a belief that comes from the Bible, but it's also something that Protestants affirmed previously, long before us, that we've long expected, and we recognize that Sunday, when it is enforced by law, will be the mark of the beast crisis in Revelation 14. So Revelation 14 speaks about 4 violations of God's law that will be ultimately implemented. A worship to the beast, which violates Commandment 1, an image to the beast, which violates Commandment 2, a name of the beast, which violates Commandment 3, and then the mark, which violates Commandment 4. This was long talked about. John Lavington, George Carlo, Thomas Tillam. There were numerous Protestants that recognized that Sunday, that Rome claimed to change without scriptural authority, was ultimately, she claimed it as her sign, and God's sign in the Ten Commandments and in Exodus 31 and Ezekiel 20 and other texts in Scripture is God's seventh-day Sabbath. So the concern that we have is, imagine a time period where blue laws are put into action, and of course there's legislation against perhaps blasphemy. And then imagine you have a whole group of people going out and proclaiming, hey, this is the mark of the beast crisis in Revelation 14. Could that not be construed by some Christian nationalists as blasphemy? And could that not then be pursued and say, you're disrupting civil order by making these claims about Sunday, so therefore you need to be put in prison because, you're disrupting civil order? That's the rub. That's the concern. And our position on blue laws is that we've long anticipated this to occur. We actually have a book here called The Great Controversy, which details in it, and we've been printing these by the millions and passing them out, that we've long anticipated church and state to unite on this very issue, and this to kind of be the point at the end of time. I guess my question would be, if you were faced with that level of concern, public concern, could that not escalate?
Well, and to kind of piggyback off what you're saying there, so that kind of Stephen understands where we're coming from a little bit better in light of that. Stephen, I kind of get the feeling that you're like, well, you guys may not like this, but it's for the good of society, and so like, yeah, you can go picket and you can raise your voice and say, hey, this is wrong, and the best person wins. But I think that something that has to be highlighted is just how big of a deal this is viewed. And that's and perhaps it can seem even dogmatic. It can seem like we're just like a dog with a bone that just won't let that subject go. But it goes back to those notions. I mean, you had in John Oxford in 1650 talking about the doctrine of the fourth commandment deformed by popery, and you have Daniel 7:25 talking about a power that would seek to change times and laws. And you have the Catholic Church, even in this book right here, saying that they changed it and that is their, their authority to do so. And there's other statements saying that they have that's their mark, that's their ability to change. So when we view this, it does seem dogmatic, right? It does seem like, oh, it's just like a dog with a bone, we're just not letting it go. But the problem is that when this ultimately does get legislated, which I do believe it will ultimately get legislated, not just on a state level, but I believe it will be on a national level, which I know you're not in support of, and I appreciate that. But I think eventually it will get legislated on a national level. And when that happens, it's not going to just be us with saying, oh, this is wrong. Like, oh, that's just terrible. We shouldn't let that happen. No, this is the final crisis for humanity.
Yeah.
This is do or die. This is the worst possible thing that could happen. And it's not because we think that the moral corruption in society shouldn't be stemmed, because actually, I think you and I actually have a ton in common about the moral degradation. I mean, like, you and I both agree on abortion. You and I both agree on LGBTQ and the sanctity of marriage and marriages between one man and one woman. Like, we agree on all of those topics. But the one rub is this, and we view it as like this monumental cataclysm. And so that's where our questioning comes from, as far as, and that's, you may be like, why are they asking this over and over about like capital punishment? And like, why are they imagining like all these horrible evils and ills that are going to take place when like none of that's like, we're not talking about that. Like, we're just talking about like a state and local level, like just on a county level. Like, we're just trying to get people to go back to church. But when you view it through that lens, that it is the mark of the beast crisis, I hope that provides some clarity for our position and why, like, when this ultimately happens, we will be the most vocal people there is saying this cannot happen. And it's not because we like have disrespect or wish ill on anybody. Like, we desire to be respectful and hold respectful dialogue and conversation. Like, we're not some boorish people group that's just trying to smash our way through. And if people were to ask, well, would you want to have a rest day on Saturday then and enforce that by law? We would say absolutely not. Romans 13 talks about the second table. It doesn't talk about the first table. So does that offer some clarity as to kind of the angle that this conversation is taking?
Yeah, and I would say that first of all, it's true that any law that is good in itself can be turned to evil.
Yeah.
So if there is someone who is truly subverting the state toward evil and it's unlawful, that would be a just punishment for someone who's subversive of the state. But that same law can be applied to someone who's innocent, and that would be an unjust punishment of that person. So even like granting your position on that, I would just say that having blue laws on Sunday are in themselves just, though they of course can be used in a way as you said they would or might or will be used. And they've also been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So if you were, if you guys were Seventh-day Adventists in the 18th century, let's just say, and you looked around and you saw blue laws, you'd think that, oh, here comes the mark of the beast. It's about to come. But of course it did not. And so the fact that there is some law that is associated with the, a prophecy or some view of the apocalypse, that doesn't in itself mean that this iteration of that law is going to be the time when the apocalypse happens. And if you applied that same idea throughout the last 400 years in hundreds, if not thousands of places, you'd actually be wrong. And so it seems to me that if the next iteration happens, it would be irrational to say that here it is because it's come upon us. So I think even granting your position, it wouldn't make any sense for you all to lose your minds over it. And if anything, should energize you to be very involved in political life so that that wouldn't happen. I think that's one of the problems with conservatives, actually, in general, is that we always say we don't want something to happen, but then we don't get involved in the political process to stop it. We just want to consume content and shout on Twitter or listen to talk radio. So I mean, that's how I would respond to all you guys. And I can imagine, and in fact, I think it would be, I don't mean this like in a mean way. I think the reaction would be irrational, and it could also be kind of destructive, because then you're saying that if I think, as I understand it, then if I'm then going to church on a Sunday in the midst of blue laws, then somehow I'm like, am I worshiping Satan then? Where is, like, am I directing my worship to Satan or to God? And if that's what you said that publicly, I think, yeah, like you would probably bring a lot of and reaction to that, and it would probably not be good overall, because most likely you're wrong. So does that, I mean, kind of respond? I just don't think, like, I didn't grow up in evangelicalism, but in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of this apocalypticism of like reading the Times and reading the paper and watching television and then connecting with the Bible. And it got everyone in a fury. And it's like, here, Y2K. And none of that actually happened, but it was effective in sort of engaging people in watching. And I just think, like, what would be better instead is if, instead of the 80s and 90s, people are trying to like read the news through a biblical lens and apocalypticism, that people devote that energy to something practical in politics or in public life, and not get caught up in that, because it turns people in a very passive, like helpless sort of way. And of course, if you guys are right about that prediction or prophecy, then it's going to happen anyway, but it could happen 200, 300 years from now. And it seems to be better to devote your energy more towards an active pursuit of change rather than this kind of like passive reception of divine providence and apocalypticism. I mean, does that make some sense?
I would agree that we've all seen apocalypticism where people are just grabbing headlines and making all kinds of scary factors over it that are baseless, and that is very distracting. I think for us, that was an interesting thought process you led us down. I think we would have a little more difficulty embracing it, because actually we follow a historicist method of prophetic interpretation, stems all the way back to the Reformers, in which there are time prophecies as well. And so those time prophecies tell us, like the longest one, 2,300 days, ended in 1844. And so the Sunday mark of the beast thing couldn't have been earlier. It's coming now. And so that time sensitivity, also our interpretation of Revelation 10 and where we fit as a movement in that, it lends certainty that it's quite near. And that's not based on headlines as much as kind of a biblical thing. The other thing I want to totally agree with you on is that American Christians did retreat from the public square after the Scopes monkey trial or whatever, and that has left a void that secularism has filled and has destroyed our nation. And I would even affirm with you that we have not done our part in speaking up on some level. But I think that if we all agree that the ultimate end would be to have every single American surrendered to the lordship of Jesus Christ. I mean, that would be my desire. And I think you would agree with that desire. But I think the Bible would say that the way we do that is go and make disciples by teaching and preaching and baptizing. And so our idea of how to get to that end, you talk about what's the end and what would be the appropriate means, is the proclamation of the gospel and the active service of our fellow humans, be they sick and we can heal them, be they cold and naked, we can clothe them, but to serve and to proclaim in such a way that God would be lifted up and people would give their lives to him. And I think that's what the Bible would say. I hear a lot more about that in the New Testament than I do about how we need to use laws to force people to
the other thing I would add to that is, while all of these individuals in Protestantism have commented on, Sunday being Rome's mark, the actual final test is when the second beast of Revelation 13 enforces an image to the first. We were just we were just up in D.C. here recently, and one of the things that we saw in D.C. was the architecture that's so reminiscent of Rome. And one of the things that we have long anticipated, we recognize, along with other Protestants who have commented even from the very foundations of this nation, Isaac Bacchus, John Bacon, a couple of others who recognized that the second beast of Revelation 13 was going to be a Protestant beast that would make an image to Rome. We connect very clearly that the United States of America is that second beast, which will make that image to Rome, ultimately not just reflected in architecture, but ultimately in law and religion, where Sunday will be legislated by law nationally in the United States of America. And so that hasn't happened up to this point in history, and no point in Protestant history, but we have anticipated that America will go this direction. And Christian nationalism, even the term itself, is very reflective of the flag of Roman Catholicism, which unites the silver and the gold keys representative of civil and ecclesiastical power with a red cord binding the two together and kind of uniting church and state. And now we're seeing individuals like Timon Klein, coming out with NatCon with videos renouncing the separation of church and state and very much appealing to joining those two together. So this is not a case of something that is just repeating what was old headlines that they never got right in the past, but it is a very clear application that, the second beast of Revelation 13 is the United States of America, and it will be that power that ultimately legislates for violations to the first table of the law. But Dr. Wolfe, in Romans 13, Paul never delegates to the state and Caesar any of the first table of the law. So where do we get any kind of, apart from philosophical arguments, where do we get any scriptural systematic foundation that it is within, especially in the New Testament context, the purview of the state to legislate the first table of the law?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think there are strong philosophical arguments for that. So what I would say, first of all, is that the human person is one who can be both virtuous and pious. And because we have both this sort of earthly orientation and a heavenly one, and in order for our person to be complete, and for those virtues, which tend to be directed to earthly things, in order for those to be complete, there also needs to be piety. So the idea is that once we direct our thoughts to God, it's not that we escape earthly life, but it's that everything else becomes properly ordered. And since the state is interested in public virtue, then it also has to be interested in piety, because you can't have true virtue without piety. So that's my philosophical argument. That argument's been repeated for centuries and upon centuries or millennia. I think it's a strong argument. I think your guys' position entails the separation of virtue and piety, or at least the sort of liberalization of civil government, meaning that they're not interested in virtue at all, but just this bare bones peace, which I think is wrong. But so I think that's a philosophical argument that brings in our understanding of our duties to God and how it relates to our duties to fellow man.
Well, Christ in Matthew 22, commenting on what is owed to God and what is to man, used the example of a coin, and whose superscription is it? In Matthew 22, we see, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God's the things that are God's." The Sabbath bears not Caesar's name, but it bears God's name. And so I guess the question I would ask is, since it bears the name of God and therefore is not Caesar's, and we are to render it to God then and not to Caesar, I would say, I know you mentioned philosophical reasons, but is there any scriptural reasons? Is there any biblical reasons? Does Paul, obviously not Romans 13, because Paul never delegates first table commandments to Caesar, but where in the New Testament do we see Caesar getting delegated with enforcing the first table of the law?
Well, I would say, first of all, that the philosophical argument, if it's sound, then it doesn't matter what, if it's true, then it doesn't matter really. If you go into a biblical argument. And I would say that the New Testament is concerned with the growth of the church, And I do not see the apostles themselves becoming political leaders or particularly interested in political life itself. And that's because they were sent to build the church, and the church is in a way distinct from, that is the, yeah, I'll just say the church in a way is distinct from political life. So I think because of that focus on the New Testament, I mean, I know Doug Wilson would have his New Testament arguments, but I don't think they're necessary. But you do see within the Old Testament Mosaic polity, of course, there is the laws against blasphemy, and I don't think that those laws that punish sacrilege and blasphemy are simply bound up with the covenant itself, the covenant of Moses or the Old Covenant. I see those as one expression or one application of the general equity of them, which would be promoting to religion because that's necessary for a robust civil society. And, you know, so that's how I'd understand the general equity of the Mosaic polity. So I'm not a theonomist, so I don't think we should just legislate that itself, as in that's like the universal law book. But it is a reflection of a perfect body. It is a perfect body of law, and for that reason, it reflects in principle, in the general equity of it, what is necessary for all civil societies to flourish, which would include the promotion of piety, or at least the suppression of blasphemy. So that's, yeah, that is how I would, that's how, but I'd also say that, I mean, Paul is recognized in Romans 13, Paul is recognizing the powers of the magistrate. There is a level of abstraction there where, you know, suppressing what is evil and promoting what is good. So I don't think he is now instituting civil government and its purposes. There's not a change in substance because of Romans 13. It's a recognition of what civil government is for all of human history, past and present and future. And what you see reflected in, say, even like Jonah and Nineveh, is that the king of Nineveh repents, and then he brings even his pagan nation under the true God. It seems to signify to me that there remains a natural principle for a formerly pagan king, that his pagan nation would acknowledge and worship the true God. So yeah, I think the position, like when you separate the two tables, I think the like to my mind, it's you're making it so that the state is interested in a certain thing, namely a virtuous citizenry. But in order for the state or the nation as such to achieve that level of, to achieve its end that God has, you know, to achieve the good and the promotion of the good for a nation, the state then has an interest in people being pious. That doesn't mean that the state has the means to do that. So several times you guys have mentioned that I want to compel worship, but I don't want to compel worship because I don't think the state can compel worship, because that's a matter of conscience. But it can restrain things that are in error, that are expressed outwardly in error. So once we go from internal error to outward error, those errors can be suppressed. And in doing so, it creates an environment, a condition in which those conduce to reception of the gospel. So you can't compel a conscience, but you can create the conditions for it. That's the same thing what we do in our families. I'm sure you guys would say that my family is a Christian family, or you know, your families are Christian families. You arrange that household by your authority, an authority given you by God and, in a way, nature itself. You arrange that so it conduces to your children's conversion. But you know that as fathers, you can't compel your children to believe. You can only, you know, encourage them, admonish them, you know, exhort them, and create a Christian household. And in doing so, you eliminate the things that would be detrimental to that end in your own household. So if suddenly, you know, some neighbor kid hands your kid a book on witchcraft, you know, and suddenly your kid's flipping through a book on witchcraft, my guess is that you're going to seize that book and throw it away or burn it or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. What are you doing in that act? You're using your natural authority in the household to create conditions such that it points them to the truth. And what I'm saying is that sort of thing, not exactly that sort of thing, but that sort of thing can happen in the civil realm.
I think it's one thing to set conditions in the household. For example, I have a 2-year-old and 4-year-old, versus setting conditions. And you say that you're not compelling worship, but earlier, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so just to clarify, make sure I understood that you would set the conditions for essentially restricting buying and selling, so that it would point people in the direction of worshiping on Sunday. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, I think that's different because, my kids eventually, my goal is you're supposed to raise up a child the way that it should go, but eventually they're going to have their own choice and they're going to be able to make that choice. That's different than setting the conditions on society that, in my view, manipulates everyone in a certain direction. You have a big distinction between a 4-year-old and a fully mature and developed adult. I would want to ask you though, because I would say I'm a pretty rose-colored glass type person. I'm not a apocalyptist for sure. But when you talk about restricting buying and selling, I'm not sure how much study, and I'm sure you probably have, but in Revelation 13, verse 17, this is talking about essentially the mark of the beast, and it says that no man might buy or sell save that he had that mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. When you start talking about that, it gets my mind, it's a bunch of red flags. And do you not see, and again, we're not doing a study in Revelation 13, but just me making that point, do you not see that how we could have concern about instituting legislation or putting in a framework that would restrict buying and selling? Because I hear that and I go immediately to my Bible and what it says in Revelation.
And actually, just to ask one more question that you can answer in addition to Brian's question, there is what is your view of the mark of the beast crisis? And assuming you disagree with us, which I believe you do, you disagree with our interpretation of the mark of the beast crisis. Well, then what is the right interpretation of it?
Well, I mean, I would respond again that it just wouldn't be. I just don't think it follows that you have restricting on buying and selling. So therefore, this is the iteration of that is going to be the mark of the beast, or that's the condition for it. Because obviously, if there's you can only buy and sell if you have the mark. That would be something in addition or a condition for your buying and selling, right? So that I think
the condition and the framework that we talked about that you proposed would be worshiping on Sunday.
I mean, it would meet that condition, but it wouldn't entirely, right? Because then but like I said before, I mean, that sort of thing has been around for hundreds of years, and this addition of the condition of the mark would be in addition to all of that. And so it doesn't mean it doesn't follow that because there's going to be buying and because there is blue laws, that this iteration of it is going to be the mark. I mean, unless you guys have an historicist reading of it, I guess. But well, I mean, I
actually have to agree with you a little bit here in a distinction sort of way. I can actually see why you say that, and I actually agree with you saying that because your worldview doesn't involve a national one. So you're saying, you're like, why is this a big deal? Because we've had blue laws on a local level for forever. And so you're like, so how does this make any sense? And so if you look at it just at a local level, then I actually agree with you. We don't actually believe that it's the local level that does it. I mean, we live here in Tennessee. We already have blue laws. Like they already have you can't go down and buy liquor or whatever. I think that's still in place here in Tennessee and Georgia and a lot of these other southern states. So we are not saying that is somehow the mark of the beast. We're not saying that some local blue law where I can't go to the store and buy liquor on a Sunday is the mark of the beast. That's not what we're saying. And so I just want to make sure we have a clear distinction here. What we believe is ultimately going to happen is that there is going to be a national Sunday law. Now, I am glad to hear that you don't agree with doing it on a national level and you only agree with it on a local level. But it's never happened on a national level. So we can't say that this has happened before and it's never been the thing, because it's never happened on a national level inside the United States. And so, but going back to the Mark of the Beast crisis, then assume we have completely the wrong interpretation of the Mark of the Beast. What are you, a preterist, a futurist, a historicist? How do you read Daniel and Revelation? Do you believe that there are mysteries that can't be unlocked? What is your whole interpretation of that crisis, if I might ask?
So I will say that because of what I do, I actually ironically don't I don't apply eschatology to or interpretations of Revelation to my politics. But I will say I tend more towards the sort of historicist view that takes the mark of the beast as being some sort of antichrist that institutes false worship and has some kind of compulsion to that end. So I think it's like the church suffers under antichrist over the centuries.
And that is yet in the future still, like that particular part, like has not yet happened?
Again, I think it's like it's more of a sort of cycle of the church encountering these things, right? So I think you guys have a much more developed view of that than I do.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah.
So
okay.
I just what I'll say though is largely because I'm not particularly interested in those questions, and I focus on certain things. So in this sense, I'm not as good as my Protestant forebears who knew everything, and I don't see how any of that comes to shape my actual my politics. And hasn't been shown yet that it does. So,
would you agree with the Westminster Confession of Faith in identifying the Pope as Antichrist?
I think that the papacy at times has been the Antichrist in the sense that they've persecuted people of the faith, and the sense of. But I don't think the only. I think the problem with Rome is that it domineers. It literally domineers the conscience. So that even if in your mind you find either no reason or reasons contrary to some position, the only sufficient reason and necessary reason to believe something is because the papacy or the magisterium says it. That strikes me as a violation of conscience, because I think God addresses us as reasonable creatures with reasons for position that is not based upon any sort of figure with on the earth. So when the papacy has sought in the past to dominate the conscience, and in a way it still kind of does, that has been an expression of Antichrist. I think that's true. But I say that though with actually a lot of respect for a lot of Roman Catholics. And I'm not one of those people who thinks that everyone who's in the Roman Church is not a Christian. So I'll say that we have our disagreements. I actually work with Roman Catholics in politics, so we'll just leave it at that. I don't want to make enemies where there's actually allies and co-belligerents here. But that is my position, that if you come to dominate the conscience via your own word, and your word is just simply you as an earthly sort of monarch, then that's first of all not a principled reason to believe anything, and second of all, it's I think violating the conscience. So anyway,
it's interesting looking at the history of course, Protestants interpreting the Roman power as Antichrist, because of course there were hundreds and hundreds of Protestants for many, many, many years who interpreted Rome as, and specifically the papacy, as the Antichrist power. And then, of course, they recognized, you look at Drew Cressner, for example, over 100 years before, in 1798, he recognizes the 1260-year prophecy of Daniel 7, that by the year 1800, the Roman power would lose its power. And we see that in 1798 when Berthier marched in and took the Pope captive, and ultimately declared that all of the former power of the Pope was suppressed. And so we see the rise of secularism and atheism, specifically in the French Revolution, which I can appreciate from some of the connections you made as well about where that push for atheism has come from. In fact, some Protestants even kind of connected it to the beast from the abyss in Revelation, I believe it's 11. But the concern that we have is Revelation describes this power as was, is not, and yet is. So it would lose its civil power and then come back at the end of time. And we can see in the United States how now we have a Supreme Court that's stacked with Roman Catholics, how Catholic policy is coming back very, very strong. And specifically on the question of uniting church and state, their position has always been that those two ought to be united and work in concert together. And so we're getting closer and closer to that element where Catholicism's getting really, really huge going on. And they're having a powerful voice within Christian nationalism today. And I think in many cases influencing speakers in Christian nationalism. Take, for example, you had Joel Webbon sitting down recently with Dr. Taylor Marshall. And Dr. Taylor Marshall's been speaking very openly lately about the separation of church and state, that needs to go.
This is from 1864. It's Pope Pius IX. He wrote a document called the Syllabus of Errors. All right. He listed things that were erroneous, that were bad, and he condemned them. Here is one of the propositions, Proposition 55, that was condemned by the Pope. Quote, right on the screen. Quote, the church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the church, end quote. This proposition was condemned as heretical. All right, so if you make this proposition, that is condemned, that is anathema, that is heretical. If you are a Catholic, you cannot say this, and I quote, the church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the church. What is Pope Pius IX teaching us? He's teaching us that there is a true integration of the church and of the state. So the church has the vocation, the call, and the graces to elevate the state. It can call the state to have a Catholic understanding of matrimony, of family, of adoption, of laws, of just war, of usury. And this is exactly what should happen. And in successful Catholic countries, Christian countries, historical, that is what happened. Were there abuses? Yes. Guess what? Humans and their concupiscence from original sin kicks in. People submit to evil. But the proper arrangement is the Catholic one, and that is an integration of church and state, state in its lane, church in its lane, but integrated.
Historically, when Rome has done this for hundreds of years, bloodshed has been the result. And ultimately, well, there may be some more mild individuals, maybe who don't want to push that far, and I can respect the statements that you've made so far and not wanting to go down a national road and some other remarks. But there are many people who are much more open, and I'm just not seeing the brakes being applied in principle that would stop this movement from ultimately going so far as to do everything that Roman Catholicism has done before in joining together church and state ultimately, because, I mean, in some cases, it has been very explicit calling for death penalty, blasphemy laws, and blue laws. And realistically, going back those hundreds of years that blue laws have occurred, the Martyr's Mirror has detailed individuals who were slain for no other reason than just choosing to rest on a different day and teach that as the principle of faith. And not in a belligerent sense of going in and being disruptive in somebody else's church. I don't think that's right to walk in uninvited to somebody's church and start yelling and creating a scene, but in the public square to go and preach, if that's not protected, isn't that ultimately an invasion of conscience as far as what God dictates we ought to say and do? Doesn't God's actions and how we worship him govern what we say and do as well?
Yeah, I just point to the distinction again on that last point. I want to talk about Roman Catholicism in a second, but there is a distinction between an inward belief and then it being outwardly expressed. Just like when you have libel and slander laws. So someone can say something and it be untrue and damaging, and then someone can sue on behalf to maintain someone's reputation. So there are ways in which outward expression of your inward thoughts can be can be legislated against, of course, like fire in a crowded theater, that sort of stuff. That doesn't exactly get at your point, but that is how I would make that distinction. So I'm not compelling people. I would never. I think it'd be wrong to compel people to say what they don't affirm, because that would be a violation of conscience. It's different than saying, if you say this, even if you seriously believe it, if you say this, you can be punished, because of what you say can actually be damaging to the public. Like if you're if you're a government bureaucrat or in the State Department, and you truly believe, let's say it's the 1980s, that communism is the way, you can be punished for saying to that communist bureaucrat, hey, we're about to do this and you should go destroy the United States. So I'm saying there's just like many ways in which you can suppress outward belief. But in terms of like Roman Catholicism, I think it's kind of overblown. I think Roman Catholicism is largely a mess worldwide, because you have very liberal left-wing factions. The Pope tends to be a kind of even though he's an American, the popes tend to be sort of left-wing. And then the church in the United States is extremely weak. There's a lot of people who actually convert to evangelicalism out of the Roman church. But if you go online, you'll see many people in the Roman church that are very loud, and they have these views that you're saying, that would be a closer integration of church and state. A big roadblock for them is Vatican II. Vatican II kind of restrains, in a way, it Protestantized the Roman Church. They were adamantly against religious liberty all up into the 20th century. Then all of a sudden they're for it. It sounds almost like Mormonism, right? They're for something, and all of a sudden they get a word. And I think so. There's a discontinuity there in the Roman Church. So there's just a lot of roadblocks for that. But there are a lot of loud people online, and I think they overhype the conversion rate of people converting to Rome. And in my interaction with a lot of converts, in a way, they are actually kind of old American Protestants. You could say they're kind of Gallican, a lot of them. Gallican meaning they want the church to be out of state affairs. And so I just don't, I know you guys have like this interpretation and prophecy. I just don't see it in terms of the facts on the ground. And you mentioned Timon Klein. Timon actually thinks the state should be more over the church. So it's not church over state. And so he's not pro-Roman Catholic. So that arrangement of taking your kind of orders from the papacy or from Rome is nowhere within the Protestant Christian nationalist camp. And those who say it within Roman Catholicism have problems with their own documents. And there's a lot of resistance from kind of established Roman Catholics, particularly the cradle Catholics. So I'm just not seeing on the ground what you're saying. You can pull here and there to try to build a case, but I just don't see the actual influx of we're going to become the sort of Roman Catholic nation in submission to the papacy anytime soon. It's opposed to even America itself. Sorry, what?
Sometimes allies can pull us where we don't want to go.
Well, what's fascinating though is and I would even say like Doug Wilson and certainly Timon Klein and everyone that I know in the Christian nationalist realm actually tends to downplay the church regarding politics. I get criticized for that, because I tend to think that the church should sort of stay in its lane a lot more than it does in politics. So, but even though the Roman Catholics Supreme Court, they're all just Anglo-Protestants, even if they're neither Anglo nor Protestant. So I'm just not too concerned by it all.
I want to be clear that when we talk about Catholicism, we don't mean it in a pejorative sense to individual Catholics. I've had coworkers that are Catholic. I'm happy to dialogue and converse with Catholics. I think that many of them are misinformed. And I do believe that, they are breaking the commandment when they're bowing down and, kissing the foot of idols over and over. But that doesn't mean that they're any worse than any other sinner out there. There's a lot of sinners out there, and I think God winks in our ignorance. So if somebody does something in ignorance and they don't know any better, then they're in a far better position than those of us who, by our own rebellious actions, willfully go against God's commandments. And so my beef is not at all with individual Catholics, but rather the entire system as a whole. I mean, even the notion that the Bible says, "Call no man father." Well, obviously, it doesn't mean it in a biological sense. It's clearly meaning it in a religious sense. So why do we have, referring to the Catholic priest constantly as father, 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 father? I mean,
well, it's not just that, but I mean, also 2 Thessalonians 2 warns that the man of sin would show himself to be God. In the Latin Vulgate, it's ostendens, to show. And in canon law, Distinctio 96 of the Gratian's Decretals, which became into the Corpus Juris Canonici, the Pope was shown to be God, actually, by, as they say, a pious Prince Constantine.
Right.
So the direct fulfillment of what 2 Thessalonians 2:4 warns about for the man of sin was actually instituted in canon law.
Well, I think about the 1583 Geneva Bible. We actually have a couple pages. I don't have them here on the table, but they're over there currently in our studio here. We have a couple pages from the 1583 Geneva Bible, and it's the Bible that came over on the Mayflower. We only have 2 pages. They're from Revelation. I wish we could have had the whole book, but it's like $20,000 or $30,000 to buy the whole book. But the couple pages that we have, it has printed footnotes in Revelation. And in the Geneva Bible, it talks about the Pope or Antichrist, and it uses that terminology because in Protestant thought at the time that the 1583 Geneva Bible was printed, it was extremely widely thought that the Pope was Antichrist. In fact, you had the Puritans, or not the Puritans, the Pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower were separatists, and they were trying to separate themselves from the Church of England at the time. They were actually specifically escaping religious persecution, and that's why they were in Holland for a while and then eventually came over to the United States. And so, this whole country was founded on the notion of Protestantism. You actually had, and we haven't had a Catholic president for the first, 150 plus years of our founding. It was only until JFK and then more recently Joe Biden that you actually had a Catholic president. When JFK was being brought on, the newspapers ran articles about whether or not we should have a Catholic run in politics. So this country very much was Protestant foundation, Protestant. The Pope is Antichrist, very much Protestant foundation in its original documents. And I'm not using that necessarily as a proof that the Pope is Antichrist. I'm just saying that is the history of this country. But you look at some of the things that the papacy has stated, and that's one of the things that we actually specialize in here on this channel, is we actually go through and we have books from the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and on that detail the atrocities that were committed by Rome. And I think that when you look at those atrocities and you look at why the Protestant Reformation came about, it becomes a lot clearer that, I mean, you literally have one of our Sacrosancta Concilia series, which we have, again, in this studio. This is a quote from there. It says, "Take care so that the sheepfold may be one. It is now divided into parts. Take care at last that we lose not that salvation, that life and breath which thou hast given us. For thou art our shepherd, thou art our physician, thou art our governor, thou art our husbandman, thou art finally another God on earth." I mean, that is the very definition of blasphemy, is to call the Pope God, Deus in terris. And so when we see that, I mean, it perfectly fits the description of what we see in Daniel and in Revelation. And it's not like some newfangled artifice that Seventh-day Adventists came up with. This is classic Protestant thought. This isn't Adventist thought. This is like historic, classic Protestant thought. It's not like some newfangled idea. I mean, and it's backed up in history books.
And to piggyback, off your points, Alex, and you had kind of mentioned earlier Vatican II, if you had a system that realized that they couldn't compel people by force, is it possible that they got together and decided, well, how about we introduce this ecumenical movement to bring people in? Instead of spice, we'll use sugar. Yeah. And we'll bring them in under that umbrella. I mean, I know you mentioned that in your mind the papacy is weak, and I think you were talking about the church in America specifically, but do you not at least, and I'm appealing to your logical side here, Do you not find it at least odd that you have all these members of Church of State or heads of state, regardless of whether they're Protestant or Catholic? You have businessmen. I remember when Elon Musk, for example, went to see the Pope and he brought his children. Do you not find it odd that all of these people that are very powerful, whether they be in business or politics, go to the Vatican and interact with the Pope?
I mean, the way I see the Pope, because I'm not Catholic, is that the Pope is a foreign monarch. And so, but he's a foreign monarch who is adored by at least some of the Roman Catholics in this country. And so, as a political act, you give honor to that man as a foreign monarch who has. I mean, it makes sense to do that, considering how many Roman Catholics are in the country, and I think that's all it really is in the end. I mean, certainly Trump doesn't care too much about religion, except for his means to get elected, and many other politicians are like that too. So I don't think that. I think that's the best explanation. It's not based on a recognition of any sort of divine status that the papacy has. But I mean, I would agree that in principle, the papacy can be horribly destructive, as it was for many centuries, and this is the reason why the Protestants of old thought of him as the Antichrist, and that's because he would be able to compel local princes or principalities on threat of excommunication and removal of property, all sorts of things, compel them to persecute those who dissented from Rome or the Protestants. And even when the monarch seemed, or the prince seemed willing to have a toleration, the papacy would go in hard by means of the Jesuits in the 17th century to try to rid those places of anything that'd be non-papal. And even many writers within the Roman Catholic writers in the 17th century would say this is the one true Church of Christ, and any sort of dissent means that you're out. You're not in the true Church of Christ. There can only be one church in this place. And so for this reason, religious liberty cannot be organic to Roman Catholicism, because they claim to be the one visible true Church of Christ. Whereas Protestantism was able to, in many cases, have a toleration between Calvinists and Lutherans, and then later with the Baptists and all sorts of things over time. And you can have a true religious order. So, but I would agree that I just don't see, I mean, the papacy just strikes me as very weak. I don't know. And frankly, like the working with Roman Catholics now is because things are so bad that if we are going to splinter and not have any sort of unity or be co-belligerents in this fight, then in the end, we're going to lose. I mean, we often joke about how we're united now, but later we'll fight over, between Rome and Protestantism. And that's, hopefully, like, if we get to that point, that's good. Because that means we've succeeded in a lot of ways. Yeah, I think one of the differences between us is, like, I approach politics from a non-eschatological or apocalyptic sense, and where you guys seem to read it from that lens. And that's, I think, like the sort of methodological difference between us. Like, for me, it's, I don't want the Hindu temple down the street. And if you're Roman Catholic and you want to fight that, I'm going to join arms with you to do that. Like, that's just the way I think about politics. And always knowing that anything you achieve can be perverted to evil, but you still have to seek the good. Like, you can't, with prudence and wisdom, you have to seek the good. And then once you achieve the good, you have to maintain it and not let it be perverted.
One thing I just wanted to comment on briefly, I know you referred to Vatican II. In reading Vatican II's documents, I think you're referring to Dignitate Humanis, but they still clarified religious liberty with a phrase within due limits. And they've always claimed the power to set those due limits themselves. So I think we're seeing, some of the more conservative, I guess, maybe rad trads, I think what some people have labeled them, very much point out that Vatican II was not any kind of rejection of the former principles on religious liberty that Quanta Cura and the Syllabus of Errors had put out previously, rejecting religious liberty as insanity, as Gregory put it.
I mean, the problem with that, like that's like whatever the line is, that is how people try to maintain the continuity of tradition, because Catholicism, it succeeds or fails based upon a continuity in substance, right? And so then they have this developmental side to it, but then it fails because what is just liberty if not fundamentally the recognition of something outside of Roman Catholicism? Like, it doesn't make any sense to speak of Roman Catholicism affirming religious liberty, but only meaning liberty for Catholics. That makes no sense. Continue. I apologize for interrupting
it's
you.
Okay. The other thing I was going to say is I know that you're not one to appeal to eschatology, as you said, but I guess the concern that I have is that in Matthew 24, when Christ speaks about the end of the age, the picture that he paints is not one with true Christianity reigning in power, but really the picture that he's painting there is true Christians are going to be the ones fleeing when the abomination of desolation is set up. They are not the ones reigning in power. And so, of course, Revelation 6, we responded to, I think, Doug Wilson, Lennox, and some of the other ones with this text as well, demonstrating that at the end of time, at Christ's second coming, there are still earthly kings fleeing when he returns in the clouds of glory. This establishes the principle that when the saints receive the kingdom is at Christ's second coming and not before. And so I guess the concern that I would have is from if one avoids the eschatology picture that Scripture paints about all the way to the end of time, true Christians will be experiencing and suffering persecution even as Christ did before, then one might miss true Christianity amidst all of that and be advocating for the ones that are seeking to unite church and state and reign with civil power, but will not be on the side of true Christianity.
So then, then what is our role as Christians in political life? Are we to not seek what is good? Like, are we not to take advantage of our status as citizens such that we can achieve and maintain the good? Because if we do achieve the good, then we won't be in the true church. Or are we only in the true church when we're persecuted? Like, it doesn't make, like, if we are beings who seek our public good, not just our religious good, then it would seem that once we achieve, but then again, we're supposed to be persecuted. It just contradicts. It would contradict those ideas, right?
Well, we should pursue for what is good. Put eschatology on the side, though. We still want to be wise in how we go about that, and that includes looking at history. And I agree that virtue is only truly realized with piety. Without God transforming my heart, and I am affected by the God I worship. If I worship the God of Baal, it's going to affect how I exercise virtue. So we do need piety. We do want virtue. But history has demonstrated over and over and over again across every nation state that's ever been on this planet that when the state attempts to help the church in trying to get this virtue to happen, it ends up corrupting the church. And actually, we don't get the very virtue that we seek. And it was for this realization that this country decided to put a hedge against the government and keep them out of trying to induce piety so that piety could actually flourish. Our founding, the founding culture of this country did want piety, but it actually believed that that piety was best advantaged by creating the conditions of free speech and openness that people could proclaim the gospel and let the word do the work.
Yeah, that is the case. I mean, at least that's what Madison believed. Most founders did not entirely believe what you said, but yeah, Madison, Jefferson did affirm that which is what I would call the minority position of the founding. Most founders actually believed in some kind of promotion of religion via the state, including George Washington, John Adams, Roger Sherman. I just go down the list. But yeah, I mean, historically, in the end, established churches have have eventually failed. But they did succeed when they were succeeding. And I think we also have to look at our times now. So we're considering, in politics is a matter of like alternatives, right? We can choose this arrangement or that arrangement. If we look at our setup now, what has been the consequence of having no establishment? What has been the consequence of having a strict, like in the sense, having the state completely separated from religion and from the church? And now, if we interpret it what we have now, then it would seem that that secularist arrangement is actually destructive. So, which alternative do we want? What do we? Of course, we learn from history. We can learn that a strict establishment like the Church of England had in the 16th, 17th centuries ended up having a lot of dissent. We can also learn from our own founding period that had soft establishments where people were free to exercise their religion, but there was funding for religion in, the hinterland and, like the hills and stuff where people couldn't afford it. So it just seems to me that, like, again, if we're going to go down that level of analysis, then we kind of have to judge our own arrangement now, which has produced a lot of degeneracy, right? So,
and I think that is a call, and I'm speaking now as a pastor, very much as a pastor here, but the degeneracy of our society is actually for a call to Christians to repent and to seek God, that if we were fully aligned with his law and fully living out his law in our daily life, the expression of him would be so clearly seen in our society that it would be able to affect change in our society. And so again, for me, the call is very much one of proclamation and of surrender to the lordship of Christ on that individual level, and then living that out, more than looking for some kind of savior to come from the government and kind of fix all these problems.
But that's just not the way that political life works. Like that has been what you just said has been the line from evangelicalism for 50 years, which is, if we focus on the family and we focus on ourselves and we focus on our churches, then everything's going to somehow organically change. And then if we vote right, always vote for the Republican Party, be the moral majority. As that was taking place, and I don't doubt that there was actually a moral reform among many people, we became more and more degenerate. And why is that? Because political society operates from the elite. It operates from the elite institutions that produce the people who end up having power, both cultural, social, intellectual, academic, bureaucratic. And so, but why did the left end up taking over all those things? Well, because they had a pursuit of institutional capture. And it wasn't simply, the left doesn't care about holiness of everyday life, of course, but it wasn't that. It was seeking institutional power. And my analysis of how public life works is that the average person follows the trend of what elites set before them. And so what I've tried to do is I've tried to encourage people to get away from that evangelical mindset of thinking that our holiness in everyday life is going to change something. It'll change you, it'll change your families, it can change your churches and all that sort of thing. But in the end, it's only like a prerequisite for something else that has to happen, which is the pursuit of institutional power. And once you have institutional power, then you can set the moral norms and direction of society, because that's how every society has ever operated for all of history. And so we should do that. And so when I say Christian nationalism, I don't mean fall back into that evangelical everyday life thing, or not only that, but it should be the pursuit of the actual levers of power in the real world, which is elite institutional levers of power. So,
you had commentary about the founders of this country and, James Madison and all the rest. I think of Benjamin Franklin. He says, when a religion is good, I conceive that it will support itself. And when it cannot support itself and God does not take care to support, so that its professors are obliged to call for the help of the civil power, 'tis a sign, I apprehend, of it being a bad one. And so Benjamin Franklin, he certainly had a colorful way with words, but he was kind of highlighting there that basically, if you have to appeal to the civil government for, I don't know, I think it's an interesting commentary. But, we had commentary here. I think James brought up Matthew 24. So if we go to Matthew 24, and this is a question, and I know we're just about out of time here, and we probably need to wrap up here. I don't want to keep you too long, but I really appreciate the time that you've spent with us, and it's been a very, very good conversation, and I've enjoyed it greatly.
Thank you.
But the question that I kind of have here is Matthew 24. Jesus, he comes out from the temple, and the disciples, in their national pride, they're showing him the buildings of the temple. They're like, "Look, Jesus, just look at this temple. It's so magnificent. Look at it's the pride of the Jewish nation," right? And Jesus kind of turns to them and he's like, "You see all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." And of course, this floors the disciples. They're like, "What?" And in their mind, like, this has to be the end of the world, right? And so they come to Jesus and they're like, "When are these things going to be? What's going to be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world?" Because they're thinking like, this is, wow, like imagine this temple being destroyed. And the first thing that Jesus says, right? Jesus is Lord. He is God. Like he is powerful beyond belief, right? What is the very first thing he says to them? He says, "Take heed that no man deceive you." Now, so the very first thing is deception. Look out for deception. I think about the Jewish nation. When Jesus was born, how many of the Jewish nation recognized the Messiah had come? Yeah, you had, what was it? I forget the name. Was it Anna and what was the older guy at the temple who, like, at the circumcision, they like recognized Simeon? They recognized the Savior, and they're like, "Wow, like the Savior has come." But that was a fraction of a minority. You had the wise men come who had been studying the scriptures and studying specifically prophecy, and they were like, "That star has been prophesied," which, is prophesied by, at least by what we consider is probably prophesied by Balaam, actually.
So what you're saying is those who studied eschatology.
Oh, yes.
Recognized
they did. They recognized the Savior. But by and large, the leaders of the country were blind and deceived to the coming of the Messiah. They didn't understand the times. So, one of the things that we specialize here on our channel is looking at historical accounts, looking at documents, looking at old books. Like this book right here is worth thousands of dollars that we have sitting on our table. We had it imported from Italy. Like we had that other one that's up there close to the TV where you're sitting virtually is from 1559. Like we have ancient documents, and we go back, and this is, Adventism became a thing in the 1840s, 1860s, thereabouts. But we have documents, original sources from the Vatican Digital Library, going back hundreds of years that affirm there has always been a minority that kept the seventh day holy that are not Jews. For example, the Council of Friuli in 791. This is from our Sacrosancta Concilia series that we got. We command all Christians to observe the Lord's Day to be held not in honor of the past Sabbath, but on account of that holy night of the first of the week called the Lord's Day, when speaking of that Sabbath which the Jews observe, the last day of the week, and which also our peasants observe. So there was Jews that were keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, but then there were also peasants who were observing it. And it counts those separately than the Jews. We have a slide presentation here on our computers that James is a lot of James's research as he goes back and digs some of these articles up from the Vatican Digital Library and everything else, going back through just about every single century, all the way back to the very beginning, with evidence that there always has been a minority of people that kept the seventh-day Sabbath. Like the Waldenses, we have this book about the Waldenses. Not all the Waldenses did, but there was a significant portion of them that did keep the seventh-day Sabbath holy. Now, one of the things that I have appreciated from this conversation is that you mostly, at least, appeal to philosophy. I wouldn't say mostly, maybe that's not the right term. You appeal a lot to philosophy, I would say, and less to eschatology. So when I see all this proof, when I see all of these slides that we've looked up and we've researched, and we've got these catechisms that talk about how they changed it from Saturday to Sunday, and you have Daniel 7:25 saying that that this power is going to seek to change times and laws, and then they literally say that they did it, okay? And knowing what Matthew 24 said about deceiving, there's going to be deception. Take heed that no man deceive you. What if, and this is my question, which I know it's a very long-winded question, but my question is, what if we are correct that there is a minority, just as it was a minority in Jesus' day that recognized the Messiah had come? What if we are correct that the minority is the ones who are correct, and that we don't find any basis for a change from Saturday to Sunday in Scripture? And if you have one, I'd be happy to hear it, although the purpose of this whole discussion was not to have an argument over Scripture. But if you have a hot takeaway that you'd like to state, I'd love to hear it, which we've, I think, heard probably every argument out there known to man at this point, because we've been doing this podcast for a while. But what if we are correct that the change is not laid out in the New Testament? God's law was written in stone by his own finger in tablets of stone, signifying the permanence, the unchanging nature of God. And in the New Testament, we are told that, these are they that keep the commandments of God, right? Like there's this continual, and I think you would see this throughout the New Testament, this continual push towards keeping the commandments, not of our own power, obviously, because we are incapable of doing it on our own, which that gets into a whole discussion of righteousness by faith. But what if we're right that the Sabbath hasn't changed, and that the majority of Christendom, just as the majority of Judaism back in Jesus' day, has been duped, and many of them unknowingly, but been duped to believe a lie? And I'm not meaning that as like I'm trying to be pejorative or like say that they're stupid or something. I certainly don't think that all the Christians out there are stupid. I don't think you are. I think you're a very intelligent person. But what if the majority of Christendom has believed a lie?
Do you guys believe that I go to a conservative Presbyterian church on Sundays. We worship on Sundays. Do you guys believe that worship is true worship to God, as in it's valid? Like, I know that you would, again, as I said earlier, it's illicit in the sense that it's on the wrong day. But do you believe that the worship itself is valid? That it is actually the preaching of the word, and that it is the administration of, I don't know if you guys believe in sacraments, but we do. So administration of the ordinances. Do you guys believe that is the case or not? Okay. But ordinances, whatever you want to call them, like baptism and Lord's Supper. I mean, do you think that those are valid? I mean, I'm a Paedo-Baptist, but whatever. I mean, just in general, like say...
we would say your fellow brothers and sisters, Christians.
But is it a valid act of worship, though?
So it would be worship, but it would not be worship that's acceptable to God or in accordance with his commandments.
And we have to be careful on how we say this, because my goal is not to offend. Cain, instead of following what God said to do, he did it his own way. Does that make sense? And so now let's remember what the commandment says. Exodus 20, it actually doesn't mention worship in Exodus 20 there. It's specifically mentioning rest.
Yeah, but you have to remember the context here is Sunday is believed and taught to be a replacement of God's seventh-day Sabbath.
I understand that, and that's why I'm saying I have to agree with James that and that's not to try and I think that if you know better, then it's a big problem. If you don't know better, I think God winks in your ignorance, and at that point he can accept you where you were at.
Because Cain knew better.
Cain did know better.
We should make that distinction.
And I might also add, it was also the religion of Cain to go and slay the one who offered true religion.
Yeah.
So he went and killed unlawfully.
So if somebody knows better and they don't do it, then they're the same as Cain, because God told them to offer a sacrifice a certain way, and they don't.
Well, but I do think that there's a difference between like valid and invalid, right? So like I would say, or excuse me, valid and licit, or illicit and invalid. And so I would say that, like, so it's like how do you put it? So some people believe that if a woman baptizes people, then it's an illicit because it ought to be a male minister, but it's still a valid baptism. So there was something in that act that was erroneous, but the effect of it's still the same. Or in substance, it still is a legitimate baptism. In other words, he doesn't need to be rebaptized because it was a valid baptism. I guess what I'm asking is, would you follow that same distinction with someone worshiping on Sunday? Or is the day so bound up in the substance of worship that every other element of it is sort of tainted or undermined such that it's invalid?
We don't require rebaptism as an example.
If someone was baptized on a Sunday, that would be a valid act of baptism, and you guys would receive it as valid, even though you would say it should have been on Saturday, unless you have a different tradition on baptism. But
well, we don't care which day you're baptized on, actually. I don't think the Bible says anything about that. But we would recognize that your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ in the Presbyterian Church, and that someone is baptized. Now that said, we do require baptism by immersion. So actually, sorry, we wouldn't quite accept the Presbyterian baptism, but of believers' baptism,
invalid.
yeah.
Okay.
For believers'
So
baptism,
invalid. If it's just sprinkled, it's an invalid. So you'd have to rebaptize.
Yes. From our vantage point, yes.
If it's an adult, okay. Well, the reason I ask these questions is not to like put you on the spot on these things, but like I can say that your worship on Saturday is genuine worship of a true church, and I'm actually kind of a moderate Sabbatarian, so I think that it ordinarily ought to be on Sunday, but it can be true worship if it's on a different day. So I guess I was asking if that can be reciprocated, in the sense that you guys might find something erroneous in the act of worship on Sunday, but the substance of it would be true. And if that were the case, then I would just emphasize that actually our difference on the Sabbath doesn't actually matter as much as you think it does. It does matter, of course. You guys, it's a identifier of your sort of sect of Christianity. And it's something to rally behind as a sort of like sectarian identity marker. But I would just, I think that it actually, regarding what I'm interested in, which is reforming the country for Christ and virtue and piety, I really don't care if you guys worship on Saturday. And I understand why you all would care that I don't, but my argument would be that it's actually not as big of a deal as you think it is, because I think the substance of worship occurs on Sunday, even according, I think, to your own perspective. And I think that making Saturday a sort of like sectarian identity marker tends to separate the possible ecumenical life that we could have, at least within the realm of politics. And probably more than that. Unless you're a hardcore Sabbatarian Presbyterian, no one really cares. Like, no one cares that you show up on Saturdays. I think in terms of what I'm interested in, it just doesn't really matter to me as much as to you. I don't know if that answers whatever. I forget what your original question was. I just don't want degenerates in my country. I don't want Hindu temples. Like, it really just comes down to that, to be honest with you.
We believe it does matter to God.
Yeah, like I think you guys should baptize babies, but like I am not going to, like, if I don't want the Hindu temple and you don't either, then I'm there next to you. Like honestly, that's just it. And that's why I don't really care about eschatology or the apocalypticism.
But going back to your observation about piety and virtue, we do believe that God cares about, that we care more about what he wants than what we want, that we would like to worship him according to the way he wants to be worshiped more than how we want to worship him. And so then we believe that piety does have implications for virtue. And so even when we look around at Christian America and how it's degenerated from the 1800s, we feel like some of that is because Christian Protestant America didn't follow the light that it was given in following all the way in receiving the correct piety from the scriptures. And the other thing I would say is you mentioned that the 19th century was kind of a high point for Christian America. And how did that come? It actually did come from revival and Reformation. That's what the First and Second Great Awakening were all about. It didn't come from legislation.
So the other thing here is I would say I don't think that any of us, I think we could probably all agree that if somebody claimed that their marriage between, say one man was claimed to be married to another man, that we wouldn't recognize that as a valid marriage. So in the context of worship, Proverbs 28 verse 9 says, if anyone turns a deaf ear to the law or turns back from hearing the law of God, even their prayers are abomination. So if worship is not in accordance with the law of God, Proverbs is suggesting here that if you turn back from hearing the law of God, even your prayer is an abomination.
David said, on thy law doth I meditate day and night. God blessed the seventh day Sabbath. He didn't bless any other day. And, there's other verses in Scripture that talk about how he cannot remove, like he doesn't remove his blessing. It's not like he's like, oh, I'm blessing you. Oh, take back. Let me have it back now. Like, no, like that is blessed throughout time. He didn't take it away from the seventh day. And so if you're worshiping on the first day, show me a verse in the New Testament that says that blessing was somehow magically transferred to Sunday. I don't find it there. And so in that sense, like you don't view it as a big deal, but David certainly did when he said, on thy law doth I meditate day and night. I mean, they literally wrote the 10 Commandments above their doorposts, right? Like they were supposed to be thinking about this constantly. Of course, that ultimately went down a deep, dark pathway of legalism where they thought they could do it themselves. So I'm not trying to embrace everything that the Jews did as accurate and good, especially in regards to the Sabbath. But God is very specific, and he did bless the seventh day. I mean, where in the New Testament, I guess my question is, what if we're right? That was my original question. What if we're right? And show me in the New Testament something that transfers the observance.
My point is that if our discussion is a matter of politics, then if you're right, it practically doesn't matter. Okay? I mean, I guess if you're right, then you are unjustly not being able to work on a Sunday. But that's pretty much it to my mind. I don't doubt that when Christians hold contrary beliefs where one is right and one is false, I don't doubt that God cares about the fact that someone is right and someone's false on that position.
Yeah.
I'm not downplaying that on a theological level. I just don't think like that we need to tie sort of natural or national revival to a sort of circumstance of the day of worship, and that become, to your guys' mind, a sectarian identity marker that distances yourselves from others in the realm of political life and Christians working together and I don't know if you guys you might actually agree with me there. And also I just don't see like historically how holding one day matters, like holding Saturday is going to matter in political life. I guess if you're very serious about that, perhaps if there is unity on that front, there would be a lot of national revival. So I don't doubt that. So perhaps you have something there, but I mean, certainly you'd have to convince wide swaths of people of it. But that's my point. I guess for me, I'm so used to working with Lutherans, Anglicans, Baptists, even some Methodists show up, that my own focus for like my vocation in life, I don't mean like, worship and that stuff and like family life, but my own vacation is saying, okay, let's like set aside in this work our sectarian differences so that we can pursue the political work before us, right? So yeah.
And I would say on a political realm, we're right with you, arm in arm, whenever you're talking about the last 6 commandments. It's the first 4 we have a trouble with. So
I
you want to talk about
you guys would benefit
marriage. You want to talk
Sunday
about
blue laws, but
yeah. I mean, even temperance and alcohol laws. I mean, we'd be right there with you because it's for the good of society and man to man.
Well, I don't know. For me, temperance is that I can't sleep if I have a drink, so that's what does it to me. But not in principle though. But
Well,
anyway.
I think we're pretty much wrapping up here, and I think if I go on too much longer, we're going to run out of space on our memory cards. So this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I think that we need to continue having dialogue across. And to your point, I actually do think that we should be having dialogue across different sects of Christianity. And I don't think that there's enough conversation like that. And that's something that we try and do here, is to have these kind of conversations respectfully, not just like debating each other and saying you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, but instead reasoning and highlighting parts of history and everything else. So I think that that can be constructive. And I think the minute that people stop talking is when real change can no longer be possible. And I do appreciate what you said about how we do need to be more vocal about some of the evils that we see in society. And we do need to be out there voting that certain of those horrendous things that we see happening do not occur. And I think that is for each of us. And I'm not talking about voting for specific political leaders. I'm talking about policy, voting for policy that is going to make actual real change. And I think that that's something that we can agree on. But we're running out of time. Stephen, thank you so much for this conversation. This was really interesting. I learned a lot, and I think it was very good to converse with you on this. And I hope that we all learned something.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. This was great.
All right. Well, very good.
Yeah, I appreciate the civility of it. It was very very much of a back and forth, and I think there's actually a lot more, unity there. I guess in a quantitative sense, perhaps than people might realize.
Thank you guys so much for joining us for this special episode here on Heritage and Hope. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel so you can stay up to date, because we have a lot of exciting videos coming soon. God bless.